So just to recap from our last speech, we learned how Greek democracy led to the study of rhetoric, as well as Aristotle's definition of rhetoric and the rhetorical situation. To move on to the rhetorical canon, we're going to have to learn a little bit more history on Greek democracy before we move on. So to go back to Greek democracy, where anyone could basically speak in front of an audience and have legislative changes made, your success and influence really depended on your rhetorical ability. And another group beyond Aristotle and Plato recognized this, and they were called sophists. Sophists unethically used rhetoric. So sophists set up schools in which they would teach people how to weaken a really strong argument or create a weak argument but make it look like it's strong, and basically teaching them how to manipulate the truth in order to get what they wanted. So sophist or sophistry became a very negative term in ancient Greek times. Aristotle fought against sophists, finding what they did to be extremely unethical. And so ethics are very much at the forefront of rhetoric as the responsibility of a speaker to his or her audience. And some of what sophists did still affects rhetoric in modern day times. So because of sophists, rhetoric kind of gets a bad rap. People call it mere rhetoric or meaningless speech. You can see in this example, for instance, with William Shatner, that it's just rhetoric, or this cartoon, it's fresh rhetoric from the GOP headquarters. So a lot of what happened with the sophists still kind of sticks to modern day rhetoric. Because of sophists, Aristotle focused very heavily on logic and reasoning as being the way in which we would persuade people. But as we move on to Roman times, other scholars like Cicero added much more flair to rhetoric, and Quintilian actually adopted some of Cicero's work and created the rhetorical canon. Cicero defined rhetoric as an art that could be broken down into 5 parts. So what you're seeing here in this definition are the Roman translations of those 5 parts that make up the rhetorical canon. So the rhetorical canon are 5 steps of invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. So you can think of the rhetorical canon like steps that you would take for a speech. You first start with invention, then you move on to arrangement, then style, then memory, and then delivery, and this ultimately leads to your speech. So this is in a way going to be a scaffolding for each speech that we do in the class. So let's start with the first step of invention. So this is the beginning stages where you're really thinking about what it is that you want to do as a speaker, where you're researching, you're looking up for evidence, you're figuring out what your persuasive techniques are going to be, even starting with your topic. All of these are part of the invention process. Now it's really easy to simplify the invention process and think, I researched, I did all this, check, I'm done. But in fact, it's really not that simplistic. A good speaker will consider the rhetorical situation when considering the invention process. So who is their audience? How do they want to be portrayed as a speaker? What's their purpose? What's their message? So the invention phase of rhetoric is probably the most important part of the rhetorical canon. It's important to discover what's out there, and great speakers and great writers will spend a lot of time in this phase. An example of that is the late Antony Scalia, the Supreme Court Justice, who was known for creating excellent arguments. So the late Antony Scalia would say that the invention phase is actually the most important for him. In interviews, he says that he can take days, if not weeks, to write decisions, and that he has a very lengthy germination process. So those who get it know that invention is extremely important. So when thinking about invention, it's important to go back to Aristotle and his definition of discovering the available means of persuasion. So invention essentially is a discovery process, but it's important to take into account the word available. That is where the rhetorical situation comes in. You have to think of the context of your speaking situation. So when thinking about available means, it's important you consider your audience, right? Who is it that you're speaking to? Because different things may work on certain audiences where they won't work for others. So demographics and cultural background are especially important to think about. Who is it that you're speaking to? When further considering audience, you might also want to think about what are their desires, their needs, their fears. All of these types of questions are going to help narrow down what's going to work best for your audience and what also may not be relevant or really effective. And these are questions we'll investigate throughout the semester. Another thing to consider in the invention process is evidence. So keep in mind, different audiences are persuaded by different types of evidence. For some, it may be testimony from a credible person. For others, it may be a credible study. For others, it may be more emotional, but various things are going to work for different audiences. So keep in mind, when we're discussing rhetoric and the rhetorical canon, rhetoric is always going to be context specific. What's going on in that specific situation is going to matter, and of course it's audience centered. It really matters who the audience is, because certain things will work with one audience that doesn't work with another. When looking at the canon of invention and how it's context-specific and audience-centered, a great example would be the audience that supports Donald Trump. Donald Trump supporters are very interesting in the fact that there are persuasive techniques that he as a speaker uses that would never work on other audiences. So Donald Trump relies very heavily on things that aren't true. Now, of course, all politicians make lies, but Donald Trump especially relies very heavily on material that is not true. And when his audience is presented with this fact, they largely don't care. Now, for his audience especially, this is unique to him. So now that we've discussed invention, we're going to move on to the other steps, which remember are arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. So in order to bring in a lot of different perspectives from the class, I'm actually going to look to another professor to continue the explanation process. This is Dr. Matt McCready from University of Washington. He's going to continue to talk about invention as well as the other steps of the rhetorical canon.